Peace and prosperity, family. I greet you in health, wisdom, and wealth. In that order, tonight we have another excellent rebroadcast. This time we are going to be rebroadcasting a lecture given by Dr. Amos Wilson on the blueprint for Black Power. And you're watching Mind TV, where we provoke thought and inspire thinking. Please subscribe, please share, and help us build our platform by sharing, this video and others from our channel to your social media networks. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. And without further ado, we're gonna get right to it right now. With Dr. Amos Wilson presenting a blueprint for Black Power.
Are a reservoir of great wealth, and certainly nobody can energize us like this brother. And as we greet him tonight, we just want to give him a round welcome applause and let him know how much we love him as a brother who has stayed true to the course. That's Dr. Amos Wilson. Let's give it up for Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you kindly. Thank you. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's great to be back here with you again this evening. It's been a while, and I always appreciate coming and being with you. And, of course, appreciate your support. And I know each time I've been here, I've promised you about our next publication, but it's definitely on the way.
All right.
We are definitely now expecting to be out in November. And, of course, each time I talk with you, the book gets larger. At last count, Brother Sababu, my co-partner there, told me we were around about 800 pages. So we're going to try to split it up for you, maybe 4 and 4. To give you some good wintertime reading. But then, in a way, it's when we recognize that we are as complicated as any other people. And one of the things sometimes we underestimate the degree to which we must address ourselves as a people. And too often we have people who think that our issues and the things that we have to deal with can be described in 25 words or less. And so there are people who think that we are small people and small-minded people, so they don't have to write sometimes some sizable material. If other nations and other people require libraries to deal with their issues, so do we. And the interesting thing about the upcoming book is that with that 800 pages, it's basically a survey looking at various areas of life. If you recall, we've titled it Blueprint. And we are essentially then trying to lay out a blueprint, a prescriptive book. Now we are coming into more and more into prescriptive type of writing, laying out very practical kinds of steps and very practical methods for achieving what it is we must achieve as African people. This means we have to cover a lot of territory. We are covering psychology, we are covering, of course, history, sociology, a great deal of political science, a great deal of economics, and related fields, anthropology and so forth, because all of these have to be combined in the process of nation building. And this is what we really have to be about. is the process of building a nation as a people. If you're not thinking in terms of nationhood, then I must say, frankly, you're not thinking seriously of being liberated. Trying to integrate and merge with our enemies is not going to solve our problem. And it's not going to happen, as a matter of fact. It is a fantasy that has kept us from taking care of business for far too long. The idea that we're going to one day be one with these people. That we're going to merge into invisibility with these white folk. And even if that were possible, we should question our motives for wanting to do so. You know, why would you want to merge with the world's greatest criminals and thieves? With the people who have the worst values the world has ever known. It amazes me sometimes how we can hear some of our parents telling our children we want to be just like them. Yeah, it's a joke. It's an insult to hear Dan Quayle or to hear President Clinton come and lecture black folk on values. How dare we let these people into our churches to try to lecture us on values? Mm-hmm. It's an amazing situation to try to talk to us about values, to try to talk to us about population control. Another joke. Yeah. The first thing we think about when people talk about population control is the overproduction of African people. You know, so-called third world people. As I said, we can solve the overpopulation problem quickly if we could reduce the European population drastically. Mm-hmm. Yes, and people, of course, as I tell you, this world has to always be backwards, you see. The ones who need to be reduced most drastically have the world thinking the other way around. Because a good deal of the problem sometimes is not the number of people in the world, but the number of greedy people in the world. Where you have a so-called minority of people who consume the vast majority of the world's resources. This large population that they talk about could eat better if these people weren't eating everything up. And so, to a good extent, sometimes, to have more for everybody to eat, you have to get rid of the greedy ones. Ones who are over-consuming, who are taking the food out of other people's mouths, you see. But here you have the people who rob you and take everything you got and then say, you don't have enough to support yourself. You know? And this is the kind of joke that we got going at here. And we're going to come back to this issue of values. But we're going to talk a little bit about African-centered consciousness, personality, and culture as instruments of power. Because ultimately, this is what this whole struggle is about. Power. Not loving one another and all those things we hear. Power. And to a great extent, the problems that we are confronted with today as African people and African people in America flows from our powerlessness or our inappropriate use of power. We've been made to even talk about it. We've been made to think that power is sinful and that to pursue it is a sinful pursuit. And that it's wrong. But you cannot exist without power. Without power, there is no life. A battery without power is dead. You need power to act, to behave in the world, to deal with the world. And consequently then, we must interpret what we are about in terms of power. And we have the power, ladies and gentlemen. We have the possibilities. We just need to reorganize ourselves, reorganize our consciousness and our personality and our culture, and see them as instruments of power, and use them as instruments of power to transform our situation. So we should not look at consciousness as some abstraction. As I often tell people, the most practical thing you can have is a good theory, is a good concept to guide your behavior, to be used as an instrument to measure reality, as an instrument to test reality. A good theory then organizes the world and organizes one's approach to the world. It permits one to be able to evaluate the world in terms of where one wants to go and in terms of what one wants to do. To be without theory then is to approach the world on an ad hoc basis, you know, just to meet it here and there, and to not approach it in a systematic form. To live reactionarily, always reacting to what other people are doing, always being overwhelmed by events and overwhelmed by the future, instead of creating events and creating the future and making the future. See, when one has then a good theory and a good concept, one is able to do that. Consciousness, without human consciousness, there is no world. It is the presence of human consciousness that brings meaning into the world. Without human beings in this world, conscious human beings in this world, in effect, there would not be a world. We bring the world into being through our consciousness. And through our consciousness, we create the world we live in. Out of the totality of reality, our consciousness cuts out a world that befits itself. In other words, the kind of world you exist in reflects the kind of consciousness that you have. And notice, if you change your consciousness or change your values and orientation, you enter into a different world. You interact with different people. People often that you didn't even know existed in the world. Social situations that you might not have even recognized until you entered into a new level of consciousness. You see people, say, for instance, who become addicted, say, to crack or something, and now enter into a whole world and enter into a whole social system that before they became addicted, they hardly noticed. They didn't know what it was all about. And they picked up new friends and new relations, whole new ways of acting, whole new purposes in life. They lost old friends, broke with old families, and all kinds of things. In other words, the consciousness, that addictive consciousness, brought into the world a new foreground and put other things into the background. Therefore, man's consciousness is a creative act. And the kind of consciousness you have will determine the kind of world you create.
All right.
And consequently, when you look at the world that we live in, African people, we must recognize to a great extent it is a world of our own creation.
All right.
It is a world that has been generated by the type of consciousness we've been permitted to be instilled in us as a people.
All right.
As I told you earlier today on the radio, we talk about the white man as having power. And I want you to recognize that power ultimately has to do with a relationship between people. And that the white man's so-called power is to a great extent based upon the nature of the relationship he has with the black man. We empower him by the nature of our own behavior and attitudes as a people. He cannot be, as I said earlier, what he is unless we are what we are. I'm telling you. To a good extent, the European is our creation.
All right.
Yes. If we look at our behavior, we will see that to a good extent it is our behavior, our values, our consciousness, the kind of personalities we've established in ourselves, our tastes, our desires and needs that maintains the European in this position.
All right.
We talk about the civil rights movement and the apartheid system of the South. When blacks decided just to get out of the buses and walk, the system changed. Yeah. When they just stopped sitting behind the white driver, just changing that relationship, changed the nature of power in that system. When they decided then to walk side by side, when they decided to walk abreast and line themselves up, because they had not walked that way before, for the ends before, the relationship changed. When they kept their monies in their pockets, when they sat on those stools and blocked the other people from them, and changed the nature of the interactions between themselves and Europeans, the nature of the system changed. So therefore we have tremendous power. It depends upon how we align ourselves as a people and how we decide to relate to other people in the world, because they cannot have what they have unless we are who we are. And that is why we don't have to spend a great deal of time always appealing to them and analyzing them, because we can better appeal to our own sense of self and our own consciousness. And we waste a lot of time trying to transform them, when through transforming ourselves, they will be transformed automatically. The power is in our hands. We are not destined to be the servants of white folk. That is not the destiny of black folk. No way. And we have to change this idea, because many of us are still operating on that concept. As I said this morning, many of us go to these schools to become what? Qualified. To work for whom? For them. Why do we assume that they're going to have the jobs for us? Yes. These people are having difficulty making jobs for themselves. The greatest problems that the Europeans are facing today, and the European economies are facing today, is that they are not generating enough jobs for their own people. And even though America is bragging about the millions of jobs it's creating, those jobs are part-time jobs. The bulk of them are part-time jobs, low-wage jobs, and jobs that have little or no future. So when people talk about creating jobs, you got to ask what kind of jobs are being created. That is why, of course, the system is not investing in black education. It no longer needs black people to maintain its employment structure. You see it bringing in people from outside of the nation to be employed. You see it even is hiring in the world itself, in other nations and other places. Already it has reached a point where its need for black males is pretty much saturated. And it literally then is warehousing us in the jails and prisons and provoking us to kill each other and to destroy each other out here in these streets. And yet we are still organizing the education of our children as if the white man still has jobs waiting for them in multitudes. How different our education would be if we sent our children to school to create jobs for themselves. To create their own economic and political systems, to see themselves as the major sources of their employment. As I remarked earlier today while we were in the radio station, I heard something about some people out here protesting for jobs and pushing these other people for jobs. And I asked the question, do we know how many jobs we really create for other people?
All right.
We are a job-creating people.
All right.
We don't realize it because we don't think in terms of nation. You see, we saw ourselves as a nation, we could see that we create jobs like any other nation.
All right.
I mentioned that today. How many jobs are created by black music?
All right.
Yeah, look at the whole structure of the music industry. From promoters to manufacturers of the records and the tapes and what have you, to the whole entertainment field, to the sellers of music in the stores, you know what we say, the Tower Records and the other great sellers of records and music and so forth, advertising that uses our music and all these things. How many thousands of jobs are we creating as people? We're creating them, but they have them. You see? We sing the music, they sell it. We sing the music, they market it. We sing the music, they promote it. You see? We sing the music, they produce great conglomerates like Sony, CBS Music, creating all kinds of jobs. We're creating tremendous jobs for a lot of people. How many jobs do we create just buying from Koreans? Buying from other ethnic groups out here? How many people are we creating employment for in terms of our spending habits as a people and our consumption habits as a people? How many jobs are we creating going to jail? We're creating all kinds of jobs and wealth. And we must come to understand this. We are creating these jobs, and yet we are begging for jobs. This means that in somewhere our consciousness has been impaired. We are begging for what we are making already. We cannot use our own creations as a source of our own wealth. I told you earlier today that the Creator could not have intended for us as African people to be a poor people if the Creator implanted in our soils all the wealth that was planted there. We talk about the minerals and the oil and the gold and the this and the that that's implanted in African soil. So it seems as if the Creator blessed us from the very beginning with wealth and possibility. Therefore, for us to be going hungry over this wealth and to be starving in the midst of it and to be perceived as a dependent, indebted people while our wealth is being shipped out to other people, we're actually selling a lot of it for pennies and nickels and dimes and less. Means that there is something wrong with our consciousness. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we've said what? That the wealth of a people is ultimately not in their land. But where is it? It's in the mind. The wealth of man is in his mind, in his consciousness. You got to look at it. And we mentioned the example of Japan. No mineral wealth to speak of whatsoever. Nothing at all. A nation, by the way, which is totally dependent. Of course, we get things backwards, don't we? We see ourselves as depending on Europeans when the reality is the other way around. When they depend on us and our soils and our people, we have to be backwards in order for this situation to be the way it is. Our reality has to be turned backwards, and we have to live in an almost permanent state of deception in order to be used the way we are used. The Japanese must depend on others for their vital resources, their oil, their timber, all of these things that they use to create their technology and so forth is taken from the soils of other people and then sold back to them. And yet they are seen as rich and powerful. And the people whose wealth they take or buy are seen as poor and poverty-stricken. Ultimately, then, you cannot rob or take from wealth from a what? Poor people. You cannot get wealth from a poverty-stricken people, people who have nothing you can get nothing from. So if you're getting all your diamonds and your gold and your magnesium and all this other stuff, then from African people, then African people must be what? Wealthy and rich. And therefore, if African people are poverty-stricken with this material wealth, then it must be because our consciousness as a people is impoverished. And we are suffering then an impoverishment of our mentality. As we said before, if you have a good mind, you can con another joker out of his land. You can con him out of his diamonds and his gold. And this is what the other people have done. They have used their mind and their cleverness and taken from us what they did not have originally. And therefore, consciousness is not an abstract concept. It is not a theoretical concept. It is a concept that is directly related to the reality that one lives in and to the reality that one experiences. It is directly related to the type of life that one will live and does live. So I'm going to look at this for a minute. Particularly the consciousness of Africans in America. I'm often somewhat amused and taken aback by the number of people in this society who claim that slavery occurred somewhere back there. And you got some so-called black conservatives who claim that slavery no longer influences the nature of African people. I wonder what those people have to conserve in the first place. Are they conserving power? They're conserving wealth? What does a black conservative conserve? You know, you have to conserve something. And since they have very little, if anything, they must only be conserving the system that has created their poverty to begin with. And you see them ultimately justifying the poverty of African people and justifying the political and social and economic subordination of African people in the name of some kind of higher principles. So slavery is not supposed, the experience of slavery is not supposed to be operating in the mentality of black folk. And you hear a lot of our youngsters will say that as well. How do you talk about slavery? That was back there. Or you know, whites talk about it. Well, you know, that was back there. We don't have anything to do with that anymore. You see. And it's an amazing situation because you have to remind them that you're still living off the interest of the wealth that your forefathers earned from slavery. You're still enjoying the accumulated wealth that began with the enslavement of our people. And if you're going to enjoy the wealth that was generated by evil, then you must take the curse that comes along with it. And therefore, even though you personally had nothing to do with it, but because you have received stolen goods, you must pay the price as well. And because you fight and struggle to protect those stolen goods, and you defend them and you organize your society and your relationship to my people to maintain them and to continue to enhance them, then you must pay the price. That's why you live in terror. That's why you're stabbed in these streets. That's why you're going to suffer, no matter how good you are, no matter how liberal you are. Ladies and gentlemen, when we behave as adults, we must recognize that our behavior will be visited upon our children, and that our children pay for our misbehavior. As we say, an act does not end at the point of its occurrence. It continues to reverberate into the future and down across the generations. And that's why when you behave in a particular way, you have to think in terms of 7 generations from your behavior as to how what you're going to do is going to affect those generations later on. And even though those children may appear to be so-called innocent, they will still pay the price of your own misbehavior. This country, whose parents and whose adults have misspent its treasure, and while they have enjoyed that treasure, ultimately their children will have to pay the taxes or will have to pay the price. So we have a bunch of people out here who think they can rape and rob the world and think that they could have enslaved the world and think then that they are going to sleep well at night. It doesn't work that way. So we have some of our people here who think then that slavery was back then and had nothing to do, and had nothing to do with them. Ladies and gentlemen, we've never escaped slavery. We still share the slave consciousness of our great-great-grandparents. We are of the same mind to a great extent that they were. We have not advanced beyond these people. How can I say that? I generally ask a series of questions. You say that slavery has nothing to do with you and slavery was back there. And I ask you the question then, what language do you speak? When did you learn that language? Was that the language African people were speaking when we were taken into slavery in America? In other words, the language we speak at this moment is what? A slave language. The language that our slave ancestors were forced to learn. And we still speak it, and you can still hear the pidgin, the Creole, and the other kinds of stuff in our language right at this moment that they had to go through. That language, with its words defined by history and by an experience, is the language we use today to guide our behavior. It's the language we use today to talk to ourselves. It's the language we use today to learn about ourselves and to learn about the world. It's the language today we use to try to understand ourselves. Is there no wonder then that we are still confused? So we have not escaped slavery because we are still using a slave language, and we speak the language of slaves. What kind of food do you eat? You say soul food? Was that the food of African people? Slave food. The food that we find most satisfying, the food that we find that sticks to our ribs, the food that we call down home, a food that we learn to eat in the quarters. And yet we dare say that we have escaped slavery, that we have nothing to do with those people back there, that was back there. When our whole very social life and social relationships our very definition of ourselves as a people, our very attempt to commune with ourselves is mediated by the food of slaves. Understand what I'm trying to get at? And how can you say that you exist in a different consciousness from another people? What kind of uniforms are we wearing? Huh? What kind of clothes are we wearing? Were these the clothes of African people? Huh? This is what we got to look at. Yes. What is this to say then that we've escaped slavery? What kind of names do we respond to? Yes. Yes. Tamikas and all these other things we got going out here. What kind of names do we identify with? Why is it that African names sound strange to us now as a people, and yet we dare say that we have a different consciousness from our great slave grandparents? How can we say that? We are still of the same consciousness, and we are still in the same position because we are still servants of the white man. And our reason for being in America is to serve white folk and to generate wealth for them. And there has been no change at all in terms of our relationship to these people. The values that we pursue are slave values and the values of servants. The social relations that we create and interact with were built and developed during the periods of slavery. We have not escaped it at all. But it is time for us to change the slave consciousness, this consciousness of servitude that is still too much with us today. And ultimately, we ask the question that's closest to home for a lot of people. When we claim that we've escaped slavery, and the slavery was something back there which had nothing to do with us today. And then I ask you the question, what kind of God do you worship? What's the name of it? Who taught you to praise him? Was this the God you were praying to before you were brought to these shores? Was this the religion you had before you were brought to these shores? Can you name one African God? How can you then, who define yourself, the very essence of yourself and the very essence of your soul, and organize the very nature of your life here on earth, based on a God handed to us by our slave masters, claim that you have no slave consciousness and are not related to slavery? In other words, then, ladies and gentlemen, we are not Africans. We are possessed by spirits and demons. We have let another people's spirit take possession of our bodies and take possession of our minds. When we speak, it is not with our African voice. It is with the voice of that demonic presence that uses our lips to speak its own language. Yes. Yes, and we have to recognize this. We are possessed. And if we are to transform ourselves and to transform the nature of our relationship with those who are our masters, we must engage in an exorcism and clear the devils out of our minds. And at this time, then, it'll pay you to read a little bit about demonic possession. And we have to be demonically possessed. Because if we talk about black-on-black violence, self-defeating behavior, self-destructive behavior, then we could not be possessed by a beautiful and wonderful God. We must be possessed by a demon. It's interesting to look at the literature on possession. We have a couple of types of possession. One is called a somnambulistic possession. Somnambulistic. Soma, in this instance, having to do with sleep. You hear it in the word sominex. You know, ambulistic, to move around, ambulatory, right? So we are talking about people who are what? Sleepwalking. They're not awake, but they're walking around. The body is moving, and it is walking in an organized fashion and walking systematically, but the person is still asleep. And in somnambulistic possession, then, the individual's original self has been repressed and displaced, and the spirit, and he identifies with the spirit that possesses him. And his I and the spirit's I are one and the same. And we have a lot of that here today, where the spirit that has been implanted in us, we have taken to be us, and we've identified with it. Who will fight and kill in the name of respect, and fight because their egotistic orientation has been insulted. And therefore, in defending their ego, they do not kill the people who destroyed their ego. They kill each other. And maintain the ones who destroyed them in the first place in power. And that's why the subtitle of my book, Black on Black Violence, was Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination. We are killing each other in order to maintain this system. We have let ourselves become possessed by a spirit such that when we become aggressive, we aggress against the self instead of those who are the source of our aggressive orientation. We talk a lot as a people about self-hatred. Self-hatred is a personality configuration. It is a form of personality organization. It is an orientation toward the world and toward oneself. Self-hatred, then, is the white man's greatest protection against being destroyed by the black man. To a good extent, self-hatred is the white man's defense mechanism, is the white man's form of self-defense. How can we say that? To a great extent, one function of the personality is to direct energy, to direct aggression, to channel aggression and energy and wishes and impulses in particular directions, to organize feelings, to organize energy, to achieve certain ends. Those things that we hate, often then when we are angry or hostile, we aggress against them, don't we? We attack them often. We destroy them. Then we have a problem, don't we? If we attack the things we hate, if we attack the things toward which we hold hostility, when we are overly frustrated and when we are angry, then what happens if that thing we hate is ourselves? It means then, ladies and gentlemen, that when we become frustrated and angered as a people, when we are overwrought by feelings of hostility, and our self-hating personality seeks to channel that hostility and channel that aggression, it's going to channel the aggression right back on to the self. Because that's the thing we hate most. So consequently, black anger then becomes a conduit for black self-destruction, for black self-defeat. The object of our hostile, aggressive feelings becomes ourselves. And you can see then how the white man is protected by that personality structure, right? While he stokes our anger, while he stokes our hostility, while he stokes our frustration, and while we get mad and we want to strike out, when we decide to strike out and aggress, we strike out and aggress against the self. And by doing so, he is left untouched and unscathed. And therefore, our self-hatred becomes his principal means of defending himself and of maintaining himself. One of the things that frightened him most about the Ferguson case was that Ferguson's self-hatred mechanism broke down. Unlike many deaf, dumb, and blind Negroes, he knew who his enemies were. And so when he got angry and hostile, instead of going out to drink himself to death, instead of going out to smoke crack and destroy himself, instead of going out to killing someone who looked like himself, instead of going out to commit suicide and put himself in a place to be destroyed by somebody else, he went directly to the source of his frustration. And this is what frightened those people. They were wondering how many more are there like that, and are they increasing? Yes. So you can see why the seed of self-hatred is planted in the minds of the black man. We spend a lot of time about what it does to us, but we got to look at it because I've told you before, every maladaptive characteristic in the black psyche is there for white folk. And it's not purely there because they hate you, or they misunderstand you, or they don't know who you were, what you're... it has nothing to do with all of that. I tell people, when you analyze the so-called aberrations in the black personality, you must always ask the question, what are their social functions and roles? Who benefits from this aberration in the black man's mind? What are the social and political and economic benefits, and for whom? Who gains from this particular orientation in our minds? And then you begin to see why it's there and what its function is. And so every complaint we have about ourselves has a political, economic, and social intent that they represent who we are. And we have now then found many ingenious ways to defend the demons that possess us. And ultimately then, those demons destroy us and have us destroy others like ourselves. There's another form of possession we call lucid possession. In this sense, the person at least has a sense of self, and they have the sense that there's another spirit in them. And they struggle with that spirit, sometimes losing the battle every now and then. They become obsessed with their struggle, with this spirit. And in a sense then are disenabled by that struggle. So some of us are in that state. We're not quite satisfied with the identity we have. We know somehow that there's a deeper African self in us. We're also aware that there's a Eurocentrically implanted demon in us, and we wrestle with it daily. There's another type of possession we talk about here, and that's spontaneous. What has sort of occurred spontaneously against our will. This is in contrast to one we talk about as artificial, one deliberately created. What do we mean by that? When we go into a particular social setting, such as a church or such as a rock concert or the like, and we go through a set of rituals and behavior, we go there and go through these behaviors and rituals and songs and dance as a mean of deliberately being possessed by what? The Spirit. And having our bodies taken over and being possessed, and then we say, we feel what? The Spirit. We feel the Spirit living within us. And so consequently, much of our life is about provoking, through artificial means, spirits which take over us and assume control of our behavior. Latent possession means when we are possessed and we don't even know that we are possessed. And I think that defines a lot of us. We're not even aware, and those are the hardest ones to break through, because they don't sense any kind of split within the personality. They and their possessing spirit are one and the same. And when you try to exorcise their possessive spirit, they feel as if you are attacking them personally. And in defending their person, they defend the spirit that possesses them. Let's be a little more concrete, and I want to just give you an example of what I mean by this. You know, and in the literature, we talk about these spirits as what we call the incubi and the succubi. The spirit that lies in the body or lies on the body, the incubus, and the one that lies under the spirit, the succubus. When we talk about this spirit, though, that possesses us, when we talk about this spirit that the European implanted in us in terms of the language, in terms of the food, in terms of the religion, in terms of the values, in terms of the social relations, in terms of the name, we are talking about a spirit that's just not a spookish entity in ourselves. It actually incarnates in us. What do we talk when we talk about incarnate? We are dealing with the Latin root carnes, which has to do with what? Meat, flesh. In other words, the Spirit comes to dwell in our very flesh and comes to sculpt our very bodies. And therefore, the Spirit is a physical thing as much as it is a psychological thing. The bodies that we have tonight, ladies and gentlemen, are bodies that have been created by the European experience and are not our natural bodies as African people. Just as the surface of our bodies reflect the influence of another people, the very internal nature and the physiology of our bodies reflect those people as well. That's why when you get rid of them, you're going to have a healing experience. And your whole body will change. I've read some of this before, but let me read it again, I think, in this context. This is most dramatic, and the things I'm talking about are most dramatic when we study the so-called multiple personality. And let me read you a description here that was printed in the Times. And those who might be familiar with it, indulge me here, because I think it points out to something. it begins, when Timmy drinks orange juice, he has no problem. But Timmy's just one of close to a dozen personalities who alternate control over a patient with multiple personality disorder. And if those other personalities drink orange juice, the result is a case of hives. What are we saying here? We got one body, but depending on what consciousness possesses that body will react to the drinking of orange juice with or without hives. It will break out in blisters. So if it drinks orange juice when one of the other personalities is possessing it, welts and hives will break out right there. If Timmy comes back, if the new consciousness comes back and takes over that body, the hives will disappear almost on the moment. In other words, then, there's a different body for a different consciousness. It goes on to say then that medical disorders that are found to differ from one sub-personality to another. In other words, even though these so-called personalities possess the same so-called body, each personality has a different order of illnesses associated with it. Each personality is vulnerable to a particular type of ailment, one way or the other. So what are we talking about? We are saying that each consciousness, which is represented by each personality, creates its own body, creates its own physiology, and thereby creates its own vulnerability to various ailments and so forth. You see, you get people in medical school who try to teach you that disease only occurs as a result of some kind of viral syndrome, or some kind of entry into the body of some bacteria, other thing, and certainly that is a part of it, and certainly there's reality there. But the body must interact with the viruses and must interact with the disease entity. And this is what we talk about when we talk about the immune system, that health is not necessarily the absence of the disease, but the capacity of the body to resist the disease, to stand up against the disease. And so consequently then, when these bodies are taken over by different personalities, these personalities apparently change the nature of the immune system of those bodies, making them vulnerable to diseases when one personality is present and not so when another is present. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, then, that the nature of the consciousness which possesses us as persons will to a degree determine the illnesses to which we are vulnerable as a person and as people. And a lot of the illnesses, physical and other diseases that we suffer then, are mediated by the nature of the consciousness that we've permitted to possess us as a people. So to a great extent, the defeat of disease, the maintaining of health, must not only be pursued in terms of discovering new drugs and these kinds of things, but must involve self-discovery and self-knowledge. It goes on to state that in people with multiple personalities, there is a strong psychological separation between each sub-personality. Each will have his own name and age. Does that strike the bell? What did we say earlier? To what names do we respond? Are they the same names to which we responded prior to slavery? So in other words, as we got the new slave personality, we got what? New names. Yes, yes, yes. And we were changed. To a good extent, our names were given us to designate our new consciousness and our new situation. Each will have his own name and age, and often some specific memories and abilities. In other words, each personality has its own history, has its own biography, has its own memory. And you look at Negroes when they have a certain consciousness and look at the history they remember. Look at the things that they keep in their memories and look at the histories they study and identify with. Look at them fight African history. Yes. Look at them want to identify with the history of Europeans. Look at them wanting to define themselves in terms of that history. And look at them having memories only for that history. Look at those Africans who are still under the possessive influence of the European implanted spirit and know that they have little or no knowledge of African history, and therefore little or no knowledge of their own history as a person and an individual. So there's a consistency between the consciousness and the history that a person has and the memory that an individual has. They often have, frequently, for example, personalities differ in handwriting, artistic talent, or even in knowledge of foreign languages. Speak a different language depending on the personality that's in there. Multiple personalities typically develop in people who were severely and repeatedly abused as children, apparently as a means to protect themselves against the pain of abuse. Does that strike another note in you? Often only one or two of the subpersonalities will be conscious of the abuse, while the others would have no memory or experience of the pain. To a great extent, the personality of the African American today has been shaped by our desires to escape the memory of the slave experience, to deny its existence. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to come in terms with it. We don't want to re-experience it psychologically. We don't want to know about it. And therefore our lives becomes defined by eternal escape and avoidance of reality and of history and of a knowledge of who we are and how we came to be who and what we are. And consequently, we cannot act upon the reality of our history, and we guide our behavior and define ourselves in terms of a fantasy as history and a misinterpretation of reality. This is what it is. Yes. How did we get this religion we talked about earlier? I talked about Star Trek, and we talk about the time warp that Star Trek depicts quite frequently, of how people move from one state of consciousness and one world and are suddenly flipped into a new world. They go through a warp, and suddenly, all of a sudden, everything that they used to use to guide themselves no longer counts. The language that they used to speak can no longer be understood in the new world. The values that they used to guide their behavior are no longer workable. In fact, it gets them into trouble. The gods, the culture, the nature of the social relations, and all of the things that they used prior to meeting the warp no longer suffice. Now they must learn new values and new behaviors and new orientations in order to adapt themselves to the new universe that they live in. We are in that kind of position today. Think about the African in the world the African lived in prior to being brought across the oceans. Think about the gods we praised. Think about the organization of our society. Think about the languages that we spoke, the food that we ate, the dress that we wore, the music, the song, the dance, and all of those things that defined us as African people. And think how horrendous it must have been for us to be thrown into this world where there was a whole new language, a whole new social hierarchy, a whole new set of authorities people pushing you around who you don't understand, people who are putting strange tools in your hands, people who are trying to get you to relate to them and to relate to each other in a very different kind of way from what you're used to relating to. Think about the stress and the confusion, and think about the abuse. Think about the horror of that situation our parents and great-grandparents were put in. And there was somebody that said then, if you pray to this God, if you talk this way, if you dress this way, if you relate this way, you'll get a greater sense of security. Your anxiety will be reduced. You will feel good, and you'll be able to withstand the pain of your existence. And the God then that I'm going to hand you is one that I have created for you. And a theology that comes with it is one that I have created so that you will continue to serve me as you continue to serve it. And we come to believe in the veracity of that God and that religion. Why? Because we feel so secure when we follow it. And we feel so relieved when we follow it. And yet we wonder why, despite all of our prayers, despite all of our devotion, we still suffer the way we do. I often ask the question, why is it that the people who pray the most have the most of their children in the jails of America today? Who shout and kick over the benches and so forth, are filling up the prisons and have the children killing each other and addicted out here in these streets. There must be a problem here, ladies and gentlemen. We must reorient ourselves to our religion. We must reorient ourselves to our gods, because apparently we don't have the appropriate orientation. Because as that book you read says, you can tell a tree by what? The fruit it bears. And therefore, if it bears bitter fruit, or if it bears no fruit at all, the God you worship says it is but fit to be hewn down and thrown into the flame and consumed. Read your own Bible. It gives you a very practical measure as to whether the religion you're pursuing is an appropriate one. And that measure says, look at the fruit that it bears. And if then the kind of religion and the God you're pursuing ends up having your sons in the jails of America, and ends up maintaining African people in slavery and servitude in their own lands and everywhere, then something is wrong in terms of how we relate to that religion and that God, because the outcome is wrong, and the outcome is destructive. And it's because we don't want to confront the abuse that we went through and deal with. You see, when you go through that time warp, the only way you can ultimately come to understand the new world is to understand what happened when you went through that warp. That transformed what? The personality. That made the personality what it was. And I find that interesting when further over, when I read here of what happens when the personality moves from one personality to another, when the body is possessed by one personality and that personality is displaced and another one comes in. It says, during the switch, there is typically a period of seconds or even minutes when heart rate, breath rate, and other physiological markers show a disorganization that is followed by a new pattern typical of the personality that is emerging. In other words, then, we go through a period of disorganization and stress, and then the personality is reorganized to fit into the new circumstances. We can't continue to pursue this, but it's interesting to look at the changes in blood pressure that each personality brings about, the other kinds of changes, physical changes that are representative of the personality. So what are we saying here then? That each personality has its own name, its own history, its own memory, biography, way of speaking, language, way of thinking, way of perceiving itself, its own vulnerabilities. Each personality generates its own life space and generates its own types of social relations. Each personality has its own tastes and appetites and its own morality. So to a great extent then, if we look at the problems and issues that confront us today as African people and see those issues in terms of the consciousness, we would recognize that we must rid ourselves of how their brains metabolize energy. There's a relationship between the areas of the brain that are rapidly using energy and the type of mental activity a person is undergoing and the type of physical behavioral activity the person is undergoing. Each personality, each type are compelled to the point that they wash their hands to the point of rawness because they cannot stop is this kind of person. The person who is absorbed by a particular type of image, by particular kinds of thought or orientation that they cannot get out of their minds. This is what we talked about. We talked about the obsessive compulsive personality, a rigid, repetitive personality. We note then, if you scan the brains of these personalities, that certain areas in their brain are intensely active. For instance, we talk about their frontal lobes, the so-called orbital lobe of the brain, the orbital cortex of the brain, the part of the cortex that is above the eyes, the part of the cortex that concerns itself with intentionality and purpose and direction and motivation, and the connection of that cortex to the lower brain, to the what we call the caudate nucleus, that part of the lower brain that deals with repetitive behavior, that deals with monitoring, that deals with modulating behavior, that deals with, in its connection with the hypothalamus and with the thalamus, with senses, with the distribution of the senses, and with organizing the senses. When we look then at the compulsive personality, we notice that these areas are intensely active, and active in a way that they maintain the symptoms of that personality. It has been shown then that when these people take a drug such as Prozac, the intensity of and they respond to them in a way that their symptoms are relieved, the intensity of the interaction between these three brain areas is decreased or delinked. It has also been noted then that you can put these same types of people through behavior therapy. That is, by changing the nature of the social relationship between the therapist and the patient, changing the nature of the rewards and punishments that the patient undergoes in an effort to change the patient's behavior, by changing the way the patient thinks about what is in their mind, thinks about the problems that they're in. And when you can successfully then reduce the symptoms of the compulsive disorder through this social conditioning, we note too the same kinds of physiological brain changes that occurs with the intake of the drug occurs with the intake of social training. Now, what are we saying then? That yes, that too, but what we're saying ultimately then is that the nature of the consciousness and the nature of the experience of the individual physically transforms the brain and physically transforms the way the brain operates. And therefore, when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about something that is real. We're talking about something that transforms both the psyche and the body. One of the things that you note when the individual is possessed, that the facial muscles change and that the body itself changes in a way that it literally incarnates and represents the nature of the spirit that is possessing the individual. So to a good extent, if you're in certain religions, you can tell what particular spirit is possessing the person by the very nature of the behavior that the individual is exhibiting and the very shape of their very physiological body and their face. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, once we get the spirits of these demons that the Europeans have implanted in our bodies, our faces and our bodies themselves will be transformed. To a great extent then, a lot of the way we look and a lot of the way we have organized ourselves physically is a result of the type of consciousness that we have. To a great extent, and I will begin to wrap it up here, to a great extent, the kind of consciousness that inhabits us reflects the kind of culture that we live in, the nature of the culture that we are a part of. Recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that culture cannot exist outside of our minds and of our bodies. Culture does not exist out there. History does not exist out there. History and culture can only exist in the minds and bodies of people. If there were no people in the world, there would be no history in the world, no culture in the world. Culture does not stand outside and direct us. It is where? Inside of us, and it directs us from the inside. Culture is instilled in our bodies and in our minds. And we have to keep that in mind, because sometimes we tend to see it as something separate from ourselves. Culture indwells in us, and it inhabits our bodies. Our history dwells in us, and it inhabits our bodies. We reflect our history, and we reproduce our history when that history becomes a part of us and is one with us. We tend to see culture in terms of music, in terms of the kind of dance we have, in terms of the songs we sing. And that is a part of culture. But ultimately, culture is deeper than that. Culture is a way of thinking. Ultimately, culture is a conspiracy. That is, it is a means by which a group of people organize the way they think, organize the way they believe, organize the way they see the world, so as to create a consciousness by which they can cooperate in achieving certain ends, so that they can mutually aid each other and gain ends that they cannot gain as separate individuals. So culture is an instrument of power. The individual through culture extended out here then is how culture ultimately comes to be implanted in our bodies. You see, we tend to look at song and dance and music as entertainment. And this is our serious mistake. We have a lot of our youth out there looking at music as mere entertainment. When we say that we are being enculturated, it means that a spirit is being implanted in us by the culture. It means our group is instilling in our bodies and in our minds a possessing spirit such that when our culture calls our name, we respond to it. When our culture is in need of defense and support, we then defend it and support it because we are at one with it. In other words, why does the black man respond to the white man? Why does the black man serve the white man? Why does everything the black man do benefit the white man? Why does the black man say freedom is doing what I want to do? And why is it that everything he wants to do enriches the European? Why is it that our youth say that they are being free and that they're doing what they want to do and they're expressing themselves and it involves buying a $100 pair of sneakers from white folk. Yes. Yes. All of this kind of stuff. Why? Because the spirit that is implanted in the human mind and in the human psyche is there to only respond to its creator and to its master. And therefore, when you let another people generate a spirit in you, when you let another people generate certain values in you, when you let another people generate a certain look, generate a certain reality for you, when you let another people let you see yourself in a particular sort of way and see your own people in a particular sort of way, they have implanted a spirit, and that spirit has been created by them, and that spirit only responds to them. And it only responds to them in terms of furthering their interests and working against the interests of the body it possesses. And this is why there's that self-destructive spirit in us. Because the demon that possesses a body is not there for that body. It is there for the creator that placed it there. And if necessary, to obey its creator, it destroys that body. It will destroy the body it inhabits. The taste that that spirit has will be taste that can only be satisfied by buying from its master creator. The values that that spirit wishes to satisfy and realize can only be realized by going through the aegis of the master that created it. So a culture creates its own possessing spirits and enculturates and inculcates those spirits into the bodies of its members, so that those members, in defending their own egos, in defending their own interests, in defending what they perceive as their own needs, in satisfying their own taste, in satisfying their own values, satisfy the needs of the culture, enrich the culture, empower the culture, defend the culture, advance the interests of the culture. And how then does the culture implant its spirit into its members? It does it in a very strong and primordial way. It uses vehicles. And one of the major vehicles that's used is music, rhythm, song, dance. A culture involves people moving what? Together, in tandem, in rhythm. It involves them having the same temporal sense, the same kind of time clock, so that they can move in synchrony, one with the other. And music is about synchrony. Poetry is about synchrony. Song is about synchrony. Music is about symbols. And you see, ultimately, it is through symbols that you evoke behavior from people. So when a culture creates symbols, those symbols are designed to evoke particular types of reactions and feelings and moods in its members. And a culture establishes the potency of those symbols through ritual, through song, and through dance. And one of the best ways then to inculcate cultural values, a cultural spirit, is through entertainment. Is while the members are being entertained, while they are feeling good, the song is carrying the cultural values into the mind and into the body. The lyrics that represent the cultural interest, the lyrics that represent cultural values, are being carried on the vehicle of the music, carried through the vehicle of the poetry. The togetherness, the cooperativeness, the mutual movement together, and the synchrony of the culture is being entrained through the music and through the rhythm of the dance. Therefore, you see, when you let another people take over your music, when you let another people take over your dance and attach their content to it, they will use your own music and your own dance and your own rap lyrics and your own poetry and your own cultural symbols to carry their message into your body and into your mind, such that you can only respond then to their beck and call and to their wishes. And you see then, yes, you see then that they get you to buy those sneakers and they get you to buy all of those things by what? Associating them with your what? Your music, with your cultural symbols, you see, with your poetry, with your rhythms. And so they attach their content to our rhythm, their content to our song. Yes. But in a way, they take our own instruments and turn them against the self. Notice how quickly, when one of our youngsters was rhyming, "Kill the police," that kind of content was washed right out immediately. Yes. But what washout occurs when they sing about shooting each other with their Glocks and the other things? When their contents of self-destructiveness ride on the rhythm of their song and of their dance. And when the symbols are loaded then with self-destructive elements and content. So what are we saying here then? That enculturation is the process of building in responsivity and ultimately responsibility, the ability to respond to a particular call. And we then have appropriately enculturated ourselves when we can respond to our own culture and to our own values and to our own needs. One other thing here then, as we rapidly bring these things to a close, we have to look at personality in this light as well. We think our personality is ours. You must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that the human being is a social animal. We exist in society. We exist in groups. We are born dependent, not independent. We have long periods of dependency. And it is the social relationship between ourselves and our mothers and ourselves and our group that protects us during our long periods of dependency. And in a sense, we never quite get over our dependency and need for one another. And so consequently, we are social animals, and we must then respond to social situations. Our personalities, because they may be our personality, does not mean that they are not inculcated with a social spirit, and they're not designed for a social end. In other words, the individual exists for the social unit, not for himself. We see individuality as something that is just for ourselves. Why are we individuals? We are individuals to a great extent because when our culture and our group confronts problems, we want to maximize the possibility that we will solve those problems by the fact that different individuals look at those problems in different ways, and they can contribute their particular perspective to the group, and those perspectives can be used as a means for solving the problem for the group. So even individuals are there to strengthen the group. You see, if all the people in the society thought just alike and saw the world just alike, they thought no differently one from the other, the society would be soon defeated because it would be uncreative. It would not be innovative. It would not be able to change its perspective of a problem in a way so that it can solve it. So what does it do then? it creates individuals. It's like the reasons why we have genetic variations. We say no matter how intense a plague may be in a nation or a people, there are always one or two people left standing. Because in some way or another, their genetic structure has permitted them to withstand the plague. And as long as we got a few of those survivors left, and as long as they can reproduce, the race continues and goes on. But if the race had all exactly the same genetic structure, then a plague would wipe out the total race and the species would cease to exist. And the same thing then operates in terms of differences in personalities. We differ in personality ultimately because these differences contribute to the survival of the species. And therefore our differences are here to maintain the whole. So the main problem of a society is to maintain enough cohesion so people can act together and behave together and act in synchrony one with the other and cooperate with each other, but not be too overly organized so that they cannot bring their own creative perspectives to problems and issues. You see, and this becomes the problem of society. So there must always be that tension between being in the society and obeying its rules, but being a little bit off so that we can say, hey, maybe if you look at it this way, we can work it out and we can deal with it this way. So the personality itself must carry the element of society within itself. But the thing we must note, that personality, consciousness, and culture are cultural creations. And the type of culture that people exhibit and the type of consciousness we exhibit and the type of personality we exhibit reflects the type of history and experience we've undergone as people. When you let another people then be the determiner of your history and experience, they then become the determiners of your consciousness, of your personality, and of your culture. Ultimately, we must recognize that we use consciousness to deal with the world. Culture is an adaptative tool. It's an instrument by which we deal with reality, by which we adapt to reality, and by which we adapt reality to ourselves. The kind of consciousness we have will determine how we deal with reality. Consciousness then will, in the fact that it determines how we are going to deal with reality, how we change reality, then is a power. Because ultimately, power is about enabling something to take place. The ability to do something. The ability to change something. The ability to adapt. The ability to defend oneself. The ability to change oneself in order to solve a problem. This is what culture is about. Culture is not static. Culture is not stuck in one place. Culture itself must reconstruct itself if the system in which it exists is reconstructed and rearranged. That is why some of us get in trouble, because we want to find an African culture stuck somewhere back in the 13th century and want to apply it to ourselves at this point in a different context. African culture is not a culture stuck in place and time. African culture is constantly changing and evolving because the context in which African people live changes and evolves. What makes it African culture is that it operates in the interest of African people. It is designed to advance African people. And therefore the consciousness must be measured in terms of the degree to which it maintains our survival and advances our interests and puts us at the center of our concerns and at the center of our purposes. When then we talk about black culture, make sure we're not talking about a reactionary culture, a culture that has been generated by our reaction to our abuse by white folk and to our control and domination of white folk, because it's a good part of what we call black culture that we need to exorcise from our psyches so that we can evolve a culture, and an African-centered culture, to advance our interests as a people. Another very important aspect then of consciousness is what we call values. Those things that we prefer, those things that we see as right, those things that we think we should need, those things, the pursuit of which determines our behavior, organizes our minds. Values are what I call the directional factors of consciousness. What are we talking about here? When you value something, and that value is implanted in your brain, the brain calls forth all of its resources, all of the contents that it has, the knowledge it has available to it, the behavioral skills it has available to it, the cognitive skills, the thinking skills and things like that that it has available to it, and organizes those things and relates those things one to each other in such a way that the value can be achieved. When we then think about something that we value and we want to realize something that we value, we consciously or unconsciously assess our minds and say, do I have the relevant knowledge? Do I have the relevant skills? Do I have the relevant thinking and cognitive skills so that we can organize these knowledge and skills in a way that we can achieve those values? If we believe we have those skills, if we believe we have the contents, if we appropriately organize those contents through thought, then we pursue those values. And chances are we may realize those values. If though we have those values and we assess ourselves, we recognize that we don't have the appropriate skills, we don't have the appropriate knowledge and content, we don't have the appropriate thought styles and so forth, we then say, well, maybe we should develop the requisite skills. Maybe we should learn the requisite knowledge. Maybe we should develop the means of thinking. And once we do this, we will then organize them in a way to achieve our values. Once we then have values and are guided by values, and those values guide those skills and contents and so forth, we are empowered to realize those values. And therefore, values are a type of power. Where am I going with this? I'm going with this to say this. If values are a type of power, if values are the things that guide our behavior, if culture is a type of power, and consciousness is a type of power, and personality is a type of power, if we let another people determine the nature of our consciousness, our personality, and our values, they then gain power over us. If consciousness, culture, personality, and values are instruments of power, they then use our consciousness, our values, our culture as their instruments of power. How does this work out in reality? They take our cultural products, our music, our song, and use them as their instruments of power. Yes, and benefit from them. So then, what is an African-centered consciousness? An African-centered consciousness is one that is based on African-centered content, based on African-centered knowledge, based on African-centered values, based on an African-centered consciousness. To the degree that our consciousness is based on African-centered values and so forth, we are empowered as African people. To the degree those values and consciousness are determined by other people, we become their instruments of power, and they use us against ourselves. So consequently, if we are to be empowered, and if our power is to work in our interests, then our consciousness must be an African consciousness. Our values must be African values. Our personality must be an African-based personality. If not, we may suffer First, ethnocide, and then genocide. What are we saying? It means that our culture will not be functional in a way that it protects our interests. We must then, as a people, develop a new African consciousness, an African-centered consciousness, and that means we must develop it based on an African history, African culture, and African values. Most of all, we must develop an African sense of nationhood. To a great extent, many of the problems we suffer today is a result of the fact that we do not see ourselves as a nation. And yet, we complain about how we are segregated from everybody else. We complain about how we are not a part of the mainstream, how we are not a part of the economy, how we are shut out from the government and the political process. If we are not a part of these things, and yet these things are what defines a nation, then we are not a part of the American nation. That nation is a white nation. We are then, in effect, a de facto nation, but we are afraid to recognize it. If we looked at ourselves as a nation, we'd see many of the reasons why we are where we are as a people. Why? Because if we looked at ourselves as a nation, we would see why we have the problems we have. Why do we have some of the problems we have? For the same reason other African nations have the problems they have. Why? Because we permit our resources, human resources and material resources, to be used by another people. We export them. We, like any other African nation, are an indebted nation. We are over-indebted. When we talk about the African nation suffering from being overburdened by debt, we don't recognize we're talking about ourselves. When I ask here tonight, how many of us owes another black institution, another black person major debt, we would get very few hands. But if I ask how many of us in this audience tonight owed a white person, a white institution, a non-African institution, great debts, we probably all have to raise our hands. If you recognize that then, and you add this up in terms of a nation, not if you just yourself as an individual, but if you look at all of us as individuals and in terms of a nation, then that as a nation, we owe an enormous debt to other people. And one of the reasons why then we are poverty-stricken is not because we don't have money. It's because all of our money is being used to service the debt that other nations own, that the white nation in America owns. And because we spend so much time paying our installment plans and paying our money out to these other nations of people, we cannot save our monies, we cannot accumulate our money and create wealth so that we can employ ourselves as a people, so that we can support our families as a people, so that we cannot build the schools we need to build to educate our children the way we need to educate them as a people. And consequently, we have the similar problems that all African nations have almost, where they cannot build highways or build schools or build hospitals or build institutions, communication systems and other systems, because all of the wealth that they are generating is being exported out to European nations and other nations to whom they owe debt. But you can only see this when you look at yourself as a nation. And when you look at yourself as a nation, then you can see that you can change this problem by changing the debt relationship you have to other people. I was looking at an issue here the other day when we were talking about looking at African nations, and we talk about the African nations as monocultures, meaning that they often exist by shipping out one or two major products. Cocoa or cocoa beans or oil or gold or something like that. And they ship these products out into what we call a buyer's market. That is, the people they sell these products to set the prices that they're going to pay for these products. So that many of these nations now are being paid less for their products than they were paid 30 years ago. And yet the nations that buy their products and lower the prices on their products are selling them back those products in processed form and selling them back their own products that have been manufactured here for higher and higher prices. And then we wonder why Africa is in debt and why Africa is impoverished. But that is the result of the fact that they are caught up in an impoverishing mechanism. But we need not talk about the continental African because we are in the same situation here today. The African-American nation is a monoculture. What is the commodity that we sell? Labor. We're not selling much manufacturing. We're not selling much other products. The major commodity that we have to sell was the commodity that we were bought over here for in the first place. And what was that? Labor. And now we are selling our labor in a buyer's market, meaning that the people who buy our labor are buying it at the prices they set. And they keep devaluing the price that they're willing to pay for our labor. On top of devaluing the price, they're no longer even demanding the labor. So after a while, we won't be able to sell our labor at any price. And we will then be totally deprived as a people. And therefore, we are caught in a similar position. And just as there's social disorganization in our African nations, there's social disorganization in the American nation. You cannot have your wealth flowing out of your nation. You cannot enrich other people at the expense of yourself and not have social disorganization. And that means then, if we look at ourselves as a nation, the African-American nation must do what all African nations must do. We must capture our own internal resources. We must gain control of our own internal markets. We must trade within ourselves as a people and a group and generate wealth within our own nation as a means of counterbalancing our dependence upon Europeans and upon the white nation itself. But in order to do this, we must have a nation consciousness. We must now organize and relate to ourselves as a nation of people. When we look at our relationship, we say to the Koreans as a nation, we see the same relationship that Japan has to America as a nation. You notice that they are bargaining right now, negotiating, right? Japan is building up its resources. It is blocking out U.S. industry from its nation, yet it is entering into the American markets and selling there and taking out the wealth of the American markets. If we look at our relationship to Koreans, to Dominicans, to other groups, we'll see the same relationship, where those groups can enter into the African-American nation, set up shop, ship out its wealth day by day and night by night, and yet the African-American entrepreneurial nation is not permitted to set up shop in their midst, is not permitted to carry wealth from their nations. And they then grow fat on the surplus that they gain from the African-American nation. This means then that if we think of ourselves as a nation, we must protect our internal markets from the intrusion of outsiders. We must not permit them entry into our nation. As I look and I see down the 125th streets, yes, and look at our people locked outside there in the outside, and some people claim that they are protesting this kind of thing. I agree with our vendors there that if black men and black women cannot make a living on that street, then no other people should be permitted to make a living on that street. We are not obligated in any kind of way to feed the children of other people before we feed our own. But it's only if you think in terms of nationhood that you can resolve this kind of problem. We have tremendous possibilities as a black nation that we don't know where. You can see these white boys over there pursuing China, don't you? Right? They're over to China, knocking over each other to get to it. What is the China market worth to the European? You know what the China market is worth to the European? $500 billion at this point. Do you know what the black market is worth to the European here in America? $400 billion. Our market is worth as much as the Chinese market, the Mexican market, which they've drawn up to bring in NAFTA. It is worth. When you enter here, you're going to leave money in the institutions. You're going to contribute to our schools. You're going to contribute to our recreational centers. You're going to contribute to the employment of our people and to the stability of our families. If you cannot contribute to these things, if you cannot create jobs, if you cannot contribute to the education of our people, then we cannot permit you to operate within our borders. This is the way a nation runs. You don't let another people walk in and have their way and walk out and leave you impoverished as a people in the name of a free market. There's no such thing as a free market. Yeah, that's white folks' propaganda. Free and open market. No free market. They force people into their market. Castro was not free to say, I don't want to be a part of it. When he said, I don't want to be a part of it, they did what? Embargoed him and locked him out. The Japanese, in the early part of the century, said, we don't want to be a part of your market. What did the United States do? Sent Admiral Perry in there and blasted those markets open. What free markets do you have there? There's no such thing as free markets. And when you learn that, you're going to be the better for it. And we got the markets, but we are not taking advantage of them. We have gotten ourselves in a situation where we are locked out of other people's markets, and we permit them into our own, such that we are locked out of our own market. And then we wonder why we suffer the way we do. It is not because we are poor. If we were that poor and impoverished, then why do those people come to us to earn their living and their wealth? It means then we must be a wealthy people. I was looking over here at a recent report. You see, we have, as a people, everything that it needs to make a nation. We have telephones, fax machines, computers, highways, bridges, riverways, waterways, trucks, everything that many nations in the world, in fact, the vast majority of nations in the world, wish that they had available to them what the African American nation has available to it. They wish they had the highways. They wish they had the trucks. They wish they had the trains. They wish they had the ships. They wish they had the computers, the telephone, and all of those kinds of things that you can just pick up and dial right away, and they don't have to be routed through France or somewhere else. The lights don't go off at 2 o'clock every day or just flip on and off. You got it all here. Then why then are we not better off than we are? Because it is not enough. As I told you earlier, it is not enough to have gold in your soil, or oil in your soil, or diamonds in your soil. You must have a consciousness. It is only with an appropriate consciousness that these things can be transformed and converted into what? Wealth and power, and can be used for the advancement of a people and the survival of a people. The same is true here then. You cannot just have telephones and faxes and this and that and not just have money in your pocket. That's not enough. You must have a consciousness that transforms those phones and transforms those faxes into a communications network that unites a people across regions and places and cities and becomes a basis for a system of distribution, a basis for uniting and creating a market from which one earns wealth to feed one's family and to stabilize one's social situation.
A pleasure. I was asked to speak on male-female relations, and I will do that, as well as deal with some other issues related to the survival and the advancement of the black community. I'd like also to invite you down in about 2 weeks to our new location. As the introducer indicated here, I am part owner of the Harlem Graphics Arts Center, a print center, copy center, center. We'll have quite a collection of books, both Afrocentric books and other general books. We are right at 125th Street, 5th Street near 7th Avenue. Right down the street from the Apollo Theater on the same side. I'd like to see you come down. We are trying there not only to build a business, but to build an institution to serve as an example for the youth and others and adults of what can be done if black people work together. We recognize that it's necessary for us to build an economy to provide jobs for ourselves and for our children, and this is our first step in doing that. We recognize that we must get access to our own monies and use those monies to our advantage as people, and that's what Harlem Graphic Arts is about. We will also give courses there that will provide education that is relevant to the black community as well. So I hope when you're down in that part of the woods, you'll come by and see us. We'll be happy to see you. Now, we're going to talk a bit about man-woman relations. The thing that we have to recognize, of course, is that the relationship between men and women, or between a man and a woman, is not an isolated situation. That the way you love one another, the way you love your girlfriends, your boyfriends, your husbands, your wives, your children, is rooted in a political, social system. Love, it just does not flow out of your heart. You know, and it's just not natural like we tend to think of it as being. It is influenced by your own experience as an individual, as well as by your experience as a people. One of the reasons why I wrote the book, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, is the fact that I wanted to bring to people's attention that you just couldn't read a standard book on developmental psychology and apply what was found in that book to the black child. Because black people have a unique history. It is the history of the black child is not the history of the white child. The history of the black parent is not the history of the white parent. The political social position that black people are in this country is not the political social position of whites. The psychology of black people flows from the history and experience of black people. If you went into a psychologist's office, he would want, or she would want, to know your own personal history, because it is only through understanding your personal history as an individual that your behavior can be understood. A psychologist or psychiatrist could not take the history of another individual and just apply it to you and say, well, I know this other person very well, so therefore you must behave this way too. And the values they have and the ideas they have must be the same you have. The only difference between you and this other person is that they have a different color from you. That is not the way psychology is built, ladies and gentlemen. You can only be understood as an individual in terms of your own history and experience. When we talk about then the psychology of black people, we must understand that psychology in terms of the experience of our people. You cannot go and get a psychology from another people whose history and experience has been different and just impose it upon yourself. You will create problems. And therefore, I looked at the history and experience of black people and talked about psychology in those terms. We must talk about education in those terms, business in those terms, and anything else that is relevant to us in those terms. We must recognize that the love relationship between the black mother and her child, between the black father and his child, between the mother and the fathers and the sisters and the brothers in the black family is shaped by the political, social situation in which we as people live. And that has to be taken into consideration. So love, you see, under those circumstances, does not just flow up out of the heart. It's influenced by social political circumstances. If there was a difference in the family in terms of who was the darker or who was the lighter or who had the good hair or who had the bad hair, that means that racism in the political social system has entered into the parent. And the parent then transfers that racism, even in the way he or she relates to the children, onto the child, and creates in that child then an attitude toward itself and toward the world that flows from being in a particular social political position. You see, then, when the white psychologist talks about the parent and the child, they can talk as if it is the relationship between the parent and the child that makes the child what it is. However, when we talk about the black parent and the black child, we must talk about that black parent's relationship to the white world, that black parent's political position in the world. How black people have been dealt with in this society must be considered. And all of these things influence, to a good extent, how that black parent is going to relate to his or her child, what they're going to say to their children, how they're going to prepare their children for life, how they are going to express their love or not love toward their children. So then you must, to your sisters and to your brothers. I want to talk a moment or two in terms of what we call the relationship between love and community. I want us to understand that love between a man and a woman, or between a parent and a child, thank you very much, is ultimately a gift to the community itself. Thank you, kindly. I have emphasized before that when you have a child, you just don't have a child for yourself. The child just does not belong to you as a mother or as a father. A child is born into a community of people. The child is a gift to the community because the child is not going to live in a world by itself. It's going to live in a community where it relates to other people. Not turn out well has to provide rehabilitative services and supportive services and other kinds of services for that child. So then when a child is born, it is not only the responsibility of the parents who gave it birth, but it is also a community responsibility. And so consequently, when one has children, one must not only think in terms of how the child is going to relate purely to the mother or the father that gave it birth, but also how it is going to relate to the people itself. A child must ultimately grow up to contribute to the community's ability to support it and to support its family, to protect its interest. Because it is only with the community's support that the family and the child itself continues to survive. So we must keep in mind then that children are ultimately born to the community because they will influence the nature of the community. If the children that are born in a community are self-hating, as we will talk later on, or have problems with their identity, or self-control, or destructive and so forth, you will see a community that will fall apart, a community that is at odds with itself, a community that is divided, a community that by its very nature will continue to destroy other children and other people. The greatest gift that a parent can give to a community is the gift of beautiful, healthy children, well-behaved children, children who know themselves, who have a firm identity, and so forth, children who are able to love healthily and love in a righteous type of manner. So in a sense, you may not be great or you may not be famous or you whatever, but we all have the potential of being good parents. And that is a major contribution to the advancement of a community and to its survival. I say that also to say that love is a gift to the community as well. How well you love yourself as an individual. The sins of the first generation are visited now until the 14th generation. Often it will take sometimes 3 and 4 or more generations for a family to live out the hate between a mother and a father. The children get it, their children get it, their children's children get it, and it can go right on before it's finally worked through. The children's reactions to poor love relations between mothers and fathers can lead to their own personal problems, their own interpersonal problems with other people as well. Those problems sweep out into the community. Children suffering from a feeling of a lack of love from their own parents may then deal with that by becoming delinquent in their behavior, by not reaching their own potentials, by not functioning in schools the way they should, by themselves getting into trouble, by themselves becoming impregnated at a too early age, and so forth. And this in itself affects community services, community resources, the kind of community that the individual lives in. So when we love as men and women, as sisters and brothers, this love also is rooted in community and is necessary for community functioning. Love, romantic love or whatever love, is not a selfish undertaking. And it should not be perceived as something just between you and your partner. It moves beyond that. It's going to influence more people than just you and your partner. It's going to influence the community itself. And consequently, then, the community has a right to concern itself with the so-called nature of love. Love, along with the related concepts, such as oneness, and we see people wanting to get a sense of oneness when they're in love, unity, uniting, being together, identity, identifying, becoming one with the person you love. It becomes interesting. We talk about love in terms of blood relations. And yet the person you marry is really not your blood relation in actuality. But yet somehow that love, if it's right, becomes as strong or sometimes even stronger than blood relations, you see. So because love tends, as we see it in this culture, to unite and bring about identity between two or more people that goes beyond their biological relatedness, that often is stronger than their biological relatedness. Love, along with commitment, caring and sharing, belonging, relatedness, commonality, having things in common, is that which creates a community, is that which supports a community and maintains a community. So then the thing that keeps a community together is, of course, the nature of love that inheres in its families and between its families. And ultimately, the nature of love that is put out toward the community itself and toward one's people. And all of this influences the nature of romantic love. When you want to destroy a community, when you want to destroy a people, as we will talk a bit about later on, you destroy the nature of their romantic love, destroy their ability to love one another in a healthy sort of way. And we will see. When you see and you think about the problems we have as people and as individuals in loving each other romantically, you must recognize in good part that problem and those problems have been set up by a political social system. Because we shall see that love, the love that we have for one another, is the greatest threat to the people who rule over us. And it is necessary for those people who rule over us and who rule over African people the world over, if those people are to stay in power, they must destroy our ability to love each other in a healthy sort of way. This is why, even if you're concerned with your individual love for your boyfriend or your husband, you cannot separate that love from what is going on in the world, politically and socially, because the nature of that love is defined by political, social circumstances. And if you can't understand why you have problems in your love relations, perhaps a good part of it is because you have not taken time to understand the nature of the political, social situation in which you live, because you have been made to think that your love is merely the concern of you and your partner and not rooted in what is going on in the world. Love is a part of the world you live in. The community ultimately defines love anyway. You see, many of us are raised in this culture, and we've been raised to think love is something just natural and just flows out of living. I'm speaking now particularly of romantic love. But actually, you have to learn how to love. Love is taught to you. You teenagers, you're being taught what love is. How are you taught that? You're taught it by listening to these records all the time. And you hear your idols singing about love. You make me feel so good. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I can't live without you. And then what do the people say? I must be in love. You see? And, I can't go on. Here's my heart. Don't break it. You see, my life has no meaning, and all of these kinds of things. And you read what? Poetry. And of course, many of you in this age now where you're writing from the city of love and from the street of this and so forth. I've forgotten my old rhymes when I was a kid. We all wrote those things. You look at TV and you see Dallas and you see Knots Landing and you see show after show after show. And you think you're just looking at entertainment, but actually they're teaching you what love is, or what love is about, how you're supposed to feel when you're in love, you see. If you feel this way, if you can't eat and you can't get him off your mind, if you dream about him all the time, if shivers run up your spine when you see him and all that means you're in love. In a sense, if there was no one around to tell you that, you wouldn't feel it. You wouldn't feel love. Now, romantic love, believe it or not, is only, in this culture, about 200 or 300 years old. Prior to, say, the 1700s, people didn't marry for love. In fact, they saw love, what we call love, as a terrible basis for marriage. They fought against it. They married in terms of maintaining family lines, in terms of maintaining property, in terms of maintaining political and other kinds of associations, class associations. Your husband might have been picked out for you at birth. You might not have even seen your husband until your wedding day. You would not have had anything to say about who your husband or your wife was. That would have been the result of negotiation between your parents, between your whole clan and your family. Because these families recognized that when marriage takes place between a man and a woman, the families are married as well. That you don't marry just an individual, you marry into a family, you see. And consequently, it was the family that came first in determining marriage and marital relations. Now, this sounds very harsh to us today because we've been brought up with this other concept of marriage, that is, you marry who you love. But we can trace the history of marriage based on romantic love. And it, to a great extent, was built on novels and poems, came out of the courts of Europe to a very great extent, which is the reason why we still use kind of the word courting. Many of those people had nothing to do all day but develop rules about how you used to court and how you deal with the man and a woman and so forth. And eventually that worked its way down into society. Poets started writing poems about love and emotion, and eventually the average person started picking it up. as the society changed toward industrialization and so forth, and as families began to break up, where aunts and uncles and 3 and 4 generations no longer lived in the same household, then people started making their own individual choices about who they would marry and so forth. And often those choices started being made in terms of emotions and feelings. We have found out in this culture, though, that merely marrying someone because you love them does not guarantee the unity of the marriage hardly any more than the other forms of marrying people as well. But the point then I'm trying to make here then is this, that even the community you live in defines what love is and teaches you to love in one way or the other. So even in that sense, love is community, and it is a part of community. To a good extent, some of the problems that we have in this country and in our communities is a result of the wrong definition of what love is, where the community has come to accept a concept of love that works against its interest. When people are getting married because they are in love, and yet half of those marriages are more fall apart, and the other half of those are living in conflict and hostility, then it must make you think that there is something wrong in the way we define love in this system and in our community. It means then there is a time perhaps for the community to redefine what love is and what love is about. It is in your interest as young people that the community teaches you a new form of romantic love and loving one another. Why? Because it will enhance your ability to stay with the man you love and to stay with the woman you love, to keep your children with you in your family, to develop healthy people and to develop a healthy community. So your interest, even as young people, should be in how your community defines what love is. Not only should you listen to these records or just dance to these records, you should take out some time and think about what kind of love is this record projecting? Is this a kind of love that is ultimately going to be productive for me and my boyfriend, for me and my husband, for me and my children? And you may find that some of these records you're listening to are really not in your best interest. While they're making you feel good and they're good for the party, when you look down the road, the way they're defining love and how a man should relate to a woman may ultimately destroy you and destroy your love relationship, the one that you want to keep so much. So then there is a very definite relationship between love and community. And the community itself has a very deep and abiding interest in what love is and how love should be defined and expressed. I want to indicate here then some things about the consequences of what we call the love instinct. Freud has a very interesting theory of what he calls the id. We won't go into detail there, but however, he sees the id as containing 2 major instincts, along with others. A love instinct, what he calls sometimes eros, and a death instinct, you see. And we'll see in a minute what he meant by that death instinct. And it's a very paradoxical kind of theory once you think of it, particularly about the death instinct, the idea that people also have an instinct that moves them toward death as well. But when you get a little chance for some heavy thinking, I think you might see it's not as paradoxical as it sounds. In a sense, we are born to die, and in a sense, we die from living. So death is almost a side effect of living. So they are kind of intrinsically related one to the other. But love, let's look at the love instinct and how that instinct is expressed. Certainly it's expressed sexually, and certainly it's expressed in terms of reproduction. So love and sexuality are closely related because they lead to the maintenance of the species and the reproduction of the species. Love involves the preservation of oneself. If you love yourself, you love your body, You love who you are. You love your family. You love your man. You love your woman. You love your community. You want to preserve those things. You want to see them grow and develop. And this is, of course, what the love instinct does. It not only, though, preserves the self, it preserves others. You want to preserve the people that you love. The love instinct expresses itself in procreation, in the giving of birth, in reproducing. This is how, of course, we maintain the life of the group itself. Love also is involved in growth, because life is about growth. It is about development. It is about transcendence. It is about enhancement. It is about fulfilling one's potential. The child, the little baby, is filled with potential. It is born a few inches long, but it has the potential to grow feet long, you see. It's born then at a certain level of mental activity, and yet there's a potential of great intellectual growth, social growth, psychological growth, and all types of growth. Love will permit this potential to express itself, to actualize itself. So you can see love is an enhancing element, a growth element, a developing element. Love then that exists in a community is the element that makes that community grow and develop and fulfill its potential. When a community is shrinking and falling into destruction, you can bet there is an absence of the right kind of love in that community. When it is falling in upon itself and the people are killing one another, hurting one another, or destroying one another, you can bet it is because the love instinct there has been misdirected or is not functioning in the way it should function. Love, of course, is geared towards survival, protection, and liberation, freeing people instead of restricting them. It moves toward discovery, goodness, and healing. Love is reconstructive. It repairs the individual. It rebuilds the individual and stimulates growth and development. Love is elation. I'm sure this is the side of love we hear most about, isn't it? Elation, euphoria, feeling good. Love has its own natural high, its own euphoria. When you're loved by your family, you love, and when you love your family, when your family has permitted you to grow and develop and fulfill your potential, when your community is concerned and cares about you and shares with you and you do the same with it, when you can sit down and not be afraid to walk the streets of your community, not be afraid to speak and say hello to people on the streets of your community, when you can have a decent conversation without feeling you have to manipulate someone or someone manipulates you, there is a beauty and there is a euphoria about that kind of feeling. There is a tendency to smile and a tendency to be happy and a tendency to be free and a tendency to be honest and open. This is what love does when it operates well within a community itself. It takes you beyond yourself. That is, it is what we call transcends. It moves out beyond. You glow, and people pick up your glow. Your love becomes infectious, and people reflect it back on you, and you reflect it back on them. And therefore, you feel good. It feels wonderful to dance and to sing and to be even a little silly sometimes and to joke with them sometimes and to play with people that you love. And it just makes you glow with health and glow with happiness, and it's a beautiful kind of thing, and you naturally want to stay with your people. You naturally want to be around your community. You naturally want to be a part of its movement forward and so forth. So love has in it a built-in beauty and glory, a built-in euphoria. We're going to see then that love can develop from love. I think Whitney Houston has a song out now. What's the title of it, the current one? I know you know it's very popular. Pardon me? The Greatest Love of All. And part of it is said she found her love when she found what? she found herself, and she found her love in herself. You cannot love, as we shall see in a moment, others without self-love. You cannot be filled with hatred and hostility toward yourself and love somebody else in a healthy manner. You can only get to know other people through knowing yourself. It is through the self that you reach others. You will only, though, get to know yourself if you're surrounded by people who love you and love you in a healthy sort of way. As we shall see, when you're around people who don't love you in a healthy sort of way, you're going to hide parts of yourself from yourself. You're going to become blind to parts of yourself. You're going to be caught up in the emotions of hatred and hostility and revenge and resentment, and your energy and your attention is going to be caught up in those nasty emotions, and you're going to be a nasty person as a result thereof. And as I'll show you in a minute, you're going to be able to love. You're going to be able to, with all of this nastiness, because nasty people do fall in love. Okay? Hateful people fall in love, and we'll see. But we'll see in a minute, it's going to be a peculiar kind of love. It's going to be a love, ultimately, though, that's going to destroy them and the people they love. Many people, I would say a large percentage of children and wives and husbands are destroyed in the name of love. I'm doing this to you because I what? Love you. And yet, when you look at what's being done, it's often projecting hate, but hate covered with a veneer of love. So then, love that comes from love permits the self and other people to develop. Love that comes from love is liberating. Love that comes from love permits other people to develop their potential. We will see later on that love that comes from hate is love that's destructive, is love that restricts, is love that's possessive, is love that makes the other person a servant of oneself, is love that ultimately degrades other individuals, you see. So in a family, a child has to be raised with love and in a loving sort of way, so that when it loves, it then will create more lovely people and lovely children. Let's look a moment then at the hate instinct. We talked about the love instinct or the life instinct, and now let's look at the death instinct. And there is a death instinct within us. Freud talks about it as saying in man there's an inherent need or desire for him to return to his origins. We, of course, are people, our bodies are made of the earth. Some of you, of course, are familiar with the Bible verse, dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. And so he builds his philosophy to a degree by saying then, ultimately, the end point of life is a returning back to the earth itself. And of course, there are philosophical issues that this implies. But I think what is more interesting is how the death instinct is expressed. We saw earlier that the love instinct is expressed in many different ways. So is the death instinct. Let's look at some of the consequences. The death instinct expresses itself in terms of hate. That's an expression of death. When you hate somebody, you also often want to do what? You want to kill them. You want to destroy them, hurt them, make them feel pain. So death comes through you onto the other individual. You see, resentment is an expression of the death instinct. Hostility, hostile aggression, retarding other people's growth and development, what we call disenhancement. Just as love leads to enhancement, hatred leads to disenhancement, disenchantment. Just as love leads to harmony, hatred leads to disharmony. Just as love then leads to growth by the person you're dealing with, hate leads to restriction, holding them back. We, of course, as people have been the victim of hatred. And hatred has locked us into ghettos and locked us into poor schooling and locked us into all kinds of corners and ghettos of all types. Hatred then brings about ultimately the death and destruction of other people. We must recognize that the world is a perfect place. And I've often said, though, that means you don't confuse perfection with good. I didn't say it was necessarily a good place. Perfection and goodness are not one and the same thing. You can be perfectly evil as well as perfectly good. Perfection has to do with the precision of a thing, the precision of relations, the lawfulness between a cause and an effect. It talks about then, when you talk about perfection, you're saying surely this thing is always followed by that thing. Now, then the point I'm trying to get at here then is this. If you have hate in your heart, if you have resentment in your heart, if you have anger and fear in your heart and hostility in your heart, the law of perfection says you are going to create a world that is destructive. You cannot have these emotions in yourself and not produce a destructive kind of world. This, of course, was what Jesus was talking about when he talked about the gospel. Gospel implying what? Good news. When he talks about love thy neighbor as thyself. Greet your enemy with what? Love. Because it is love what? God before all else. Be filled with the love of God. And to be filled with God is to be filled with love. And therefore, a nation of godly people is not a nation that is racist, is not a nation that kills and destroys the earth and kills and destroys its people. You cannot have war, death, and destruction where true and righteous love exists between people. And what Christ was trying to get at then was this. If we could come to love others as we love ourselves, if we could come, and notice it says, as ourselves, which means we love ourselves as well, and it is through the process of loving oneself deeply that we love other people deeply as well. Out of that then becomes a world filled with love, and the kingdom of God comes to earth itself. In a world, though, filled with hate and resentment and anger, you're going to get a world then filled with war, murder, death, suicide, robbery, rape, violence, and all the kinds of things we see so much about in the everyday news. This is one of the reasons why you know that this nation is not a Christian nation. You got people who go to church. The Christian so-called religion is the predominant religion, but the people are not filled with Christianity by any stretch of the imagination, ladies and gentlemen. If this country was a true Christian country, we wouldn't even be here talking about black men and black women love and all that kind of thing, would we? We wouldn't be talking about our problems as a what? As a race and as a people. Because that kind of problem would not exist with people who truly love and had the love of God within them. But it is because we don't have that love that we have the kinds of problems we have today. This is why ultimately Jesus and the other prophets can predict the end of the world as being one of death and war, because ultimately people filled with love and egotism and false pride and the other kinds of things are going to bring war and death upon themselves. And this is, of course, is what we see today. Reagan has no love, no righteous love. Gorbachev has no righteous love. People with righteous love cannot make guns and weapons that threaten to destroy the whole of the human race. These weapons come out of what? Hate, fear, anger, pride, resentment, and the other kinds of things. So then, When we express hatred and hostility, we are expressing the hate instinct. And when you see then that death instinct, the hate instinct being expressed, you see then ultimately it leads to the destruction of something. It can lead to the destruction of the buildings you live in. You hate the landlord. You hate the people who live in it. You hate yourself, and then you destroy the buildings around you, destroy the people around you. Anything that gets your neighbor's goat, you do. You like to see them upset. You like to blow their cool. You like to do things to them out of this instinct. Well, some of us can take hate that is expressed against our enemies. So, hey, they deserve whatever they get, right? And they deserve death, or they deserve the pain that we put on them. But you know, there's one thing peculiar about the hate instinct and the death instinct. It's no respecter of persons. Your own death instinct can turn around against you as an individual. You not only can hate other people, but you can what? Hate yourself. And that hatred that destroys other people, that pains other people, that kills other people, that same hatred, when it's curved around toward you, it's not going to stop doing it, is it? It's going to do the same thing to you. It's going to turn right back around into self-destruction, suicide. In some instances, we say the person that commits suicide is the individual who really wanted to kill somebody else. But for some reason, they lacked the courage, or they didn't quite know who they wanted to kill, or what have you, and ultimately they turned then that instinct upon themselves. Hate then leads to self-alienation and self-destruction. It leads to depression. You know, when you're depressed, you talk about yourself. I'm no good. I'm a low so-and-so and so. I don't deserve to live. I'm worthless. The same kind of thing that you tell another person when you hate them. You're low. You're this. You're a dirty dog. So forth. When you're in depression, often you'll do what? Turn it right back around on yourself. I don't deserve to live. When you hate somebody else, you say, you don't deserve to live, I'm going to kill you. Often then, when you're into self-hatred, you tell yourself the same thing. I hate myself. I don't deserve it. I could just die. I wish I would die. And often people will proceed to die and to kill themselves. It leads then to descendants, where the love instinct leads to transcendence and moving beyond the self. Often then the hate instinct moves to descendants and going into oneself to decadence. Hatred leads, it has its euphoria, but it's an unnatural euphoria. That is, you're going to get your kicks not from self-love and the loving of others, but from trying to deal with your own self-hatred, trying to escape your own self-hatred. You can only feel good when you've hurt somebody. You can only feel good when you've slandered someone, when you cut someone down, embarrassed them, conquered them, beat them in some kind of way. So you have some people, they get a euphoria from hate, but it is a euphoria that leads either to the destruction of themselves or the destruction of someone else. Or in dealing with that euphoria, then they have to go into drugs and alcohols and the other kinds of things as a way of getting a good feeling one way or the other, because hatred is not a good feeling, whether it's expressed outward ultimately or inward. It leads to sadism, the desire to hurt someone else and then get a pleasure from seeing them hurt. You have some people we call sadists, right? Whose only pleasure and sexual pleasure is putting someone else in pain. Often the rapist does not really want sex from the woman. And sometimes with the rapist you can say, well, here it is, you can have all you want. And at that point he loses his interest. He wants you to what? Struggle and fight, and he wants to degrade you and hurt you. And it's only through the degrading of his victim and hurting the victim and forcing the victim against their will and seeing the victim in pain that he gets his climax or gets his sexual jollies, you see. And this is what the sadist is about. A person filled with hate is often a person who can only get pleasure through hurting in one form or another. Masochism is also in there. The individual who can only get some pleasure from being hurt, from being dominated, from being ruled, from being degraded. in some form or another. And you have places in the village where masochists hang out, waiting for someone to come along and treat them like a dog for the night, so that they can get at some kind of sexual pleasure. It's a pathetic kind of situation. A lot of this hatred comes out, a lot of this pleasure comes from enslavement. Now let's look then at the kind of love, as we said earlier, that comes from hate. We said nasty people love. Oh, they get all these great feelings we talk about in the records. And they go for trying to hook into someone and get someone to love them only. And they experience this great love. But, ladies and gentlemen, it is not enough to love. The love must be based on the right foundation. One of the reasons why so many marriages are falling apart today, even though the people, when you see them on their wedding day, they say they're getting married because they love each other, is because they love each other for the wrong reason. It is not enough for you to have a feeling of love, to be caught up in the cuteness of some boy, or to be caught up in how sweet he is, or to be caught up in how you can't get him out of your mind, how he makes you feel, how his touch just makes you go off all over. It's not enough. That's not enough. You cannot base a family or long-term relationship on that kind of love. You cannot base having children on that kind of love, you see. You must stand back and look and see upon what kind of love, on what kind of roots that love is growing from. And you may note then that that love is growing out of hate, that love is growing out of resentment, that it's growing out of an unhealthy situation. And even though you have this great feeling and this great longing and this great need, those feelings and those longings and those needs will ultimately destroy the one you love and destroy the children that you claim to love. Because a love that flows out of hatred is a love that's ultimately selfish and self-centered. Is a love that ultimately does not give the other person humanity and does not recognize them as an individual. This kind of love is a love where you love yourself, but you can only love yourself at the expense of destroying the ones you love, only at reducing them in some form or another. Love that comes out of hate is a love where you're going to love somebody who maintains you in your self-destructiveness. What did we say earlier? When you hate and you hate yourself, you also engage in self-destructiveness. Now, the people that you fall in love with will often be the people who help you maintain your self-destructive nature. You love them because they help you what? Destroy yourself. Oh, I go with her because she's hip. You know, she smokes like me. You see? She shoots heroin like I do. I love her for that reason. I can't stand these straight people who don't smoke. I can't be around these people who don't shoot heroin. I can't be around these people, who don't like to fuss and fight and hate and drink and so forth. But I love this guy. They're real cool people because they support. Your friends are often your worst enemies because often you pick them because they do not confront you with truth. They do not confront you with your reality. They help to maintain you in your own self-deception. They don't say, hey, you're wrong. You're destroying yourself. It's terrible. Often we get rid of those people. They make us angry. Hey, I'm having fun. You blew my high, man. You blew my head. This person hanging around here, they not smoking and partying with me. You put a wet blanket on the whole party. And, of course, the thing you're running from, of course, is that they may be pointing out how foolish and self-destructive you are. But you don't want to face that right now. So what do? You move toward people who support this. So the self-hating person falls in love, surely, and experiences love, surely. But 9 times out of 10, they're going to move toward a person who maintains their self-destructiveness. A part of the problem with the black love situation today, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have been duped into self-hatred by the European. You see? He's made us hate our heritage, hate our skin, hate our hair, hate our noses and our lips. He's made us hate Africa itself and the whole African heritage. He's made us hate being black as individuals. So consequently, we're going to love somebody who doesn't remind us of who we are and what we are. You see, and we move then in our love toward people who can help us what? Escape from that which we hate. And that's why we will often love our enemies if those enemies can take us away from ourselves. That's why we love our overeating. We love our over-sexing ourselves. We love our drugs. Anything that does what? Takes us away from our situation, we love it. And you will see, ladies and gentlemen, when you're in an oppressed situation, your world must be reversed. The European is 10% of the world's population, but yet rules over the other 90%. Europeans have no real natural resources or whatever, real natural wealth in their land, but yet they are the richest people on earth. Japan has no natural resources whatever, but yet it is seen as a powerful nation. These nations can only achieve that by maintaining the other 90% of the world in a state of deception, in a state of craziness and madness. That's the only way it can be done. You can only be robbed when you're deceived and you don't know what to do with the wealth that you have. And this is the community we have here today. The black community here, if we looked at it as a nation, would be the 10th or 9th richest nation on earth, but yet you call yourself poor. You don't want to educate your own children using your own money. You can't build your own schools and build your own universities and build your own nations. Not because you don't have money, but because the love you have makes you spend the money with your enemy. And you spend it then with the pusher and with the other person, and they make you feel good, and you love them because they supply you with this. And this love then, of course, takes you away. And you hate the people who don't supply you with that, even though they're your best friends, you see, and you attack them. So then this self-hatred that has been introduced into the black man means that often, if we do not clear this self-hatred out, we will love each other, yes, but the kind of love we have for each other will often end up destroying us. It will destroy our children, and we see many of our children are destroyed in the name of what? Love. Many of you youngsters will have children out of wedlock before you're prepared to have children, before you've grown in wisdom and knowledge. Why? Because what? I love him. He loves me. I wanted to have someone I could love all to myself. You got to know how to love. And sometimes you haven't grown enough yet to know what real love is about and how to truly love an individual. Love is not just a good feeling. It is about more than good feeling. As I will show you later, heroin makes you feel good too. Crack makes you feel good too. All kinds of destructive things make you feel good. And so if you love simply because you feel so good, then you can still love in a way that's going to destroy you and destroy the people that are with you. So it's not enough for you to have a baby for a boy because he makes you feel so good when you're with him, or because you have this great feeling. You see, it's deeper than that, and it involves more than that. People then who have not come to terms with their self-hatred are people who are going to love in a way that's going to destroy them. In order for us to be ruled over by this minority of people, we have to be backwards. Our minds have to be turned backwards. As I said earlier, this people who rule us today, we are a minority people in the world. We're not, we are a what? A majority people in the world. We're not minorities. There are many, many more black people in the world than there are white people, ladies and gentlemen. Many more. However, we've been deceived into thinking of ourselves as minorities. The European countries are dependent on us. We're not dependent on them. They must get their mineral resources from Africa. They must get their oil from Africa. They must get their diamonds from Africa. These computers and these technological instruments you see here today are only made possible through the minerals taken from the southern tip of Africa itself, because the minerals and metals are not found in this country at all. up to almost 100% of the metals and other things that make space probing possible, that make satellites possible, that make jet planes possible and so forth, come right out of the soils of Africa. And yet we see Africans over there starving to death, ladies and gentlemen. And then they're projected as being what? Dependent nations. But it is the European who is dependent, but he must make you think what? That you are dependent. It's the old con game, isn't it? Yeah. This is the only way a minority of people, though, can rule over a giant. You see, it's by conning them. It's like, you're the weak one. You're the dependent one. You need me. You can't live without me. You can't have all these TVs and this stuff if I didn't exist in the world. And, of course, when you think that, you then submit and give your wealth away and hand it to them and let them have it. And then they, of course, use that same wealth against you to destroy you, to restrict you in various sorts of ways. So we must be so. When you're filled with self-hate, your mind is reversed. What it means is this: you will love the things that destroy you, and you will hate the things that advance your growth. And you watch and look at your behavior. Look at the behavior of your compatriots and watch if what I'm saying is not true. I hate to read. I hate to study. I hate to learn. Oh, but I love to party. I love to smoke. I love to drink. I love to screw. I love to, ho. And all the loves often you will find will be loves that what? That don't advance you one bit, and yet you can't get over them. You're addicted to them, you see. But the things that lead to growth in wisdom, knowledge, you see, self-understanding and self-discovery, healthy relations, self-control, all those things are hateful. But this is the only way a minority can rule over a majority of people, is by turning their minds backwards so that they love the things that destroy them and hate the things that move them forward. In order for these people to rule over us, we must hate learning. It has to be built into us. We must think that we can't do math. Because you see, if we do math, if we were into learning, if we were into research and into thinking and into, real philosophical ideas and abstractions, we would defeat those people. They know it. So consequently, what they must do is rob you of all of these things so that they may stay in their place. And you'll see that even in the man-woman relationship. A man often robbing the woman of any intellectual growth, any personal growth, any knowledge, any wisdom, because he sees that as the only way he can rule over her and maintain her under control. And if she shows that she's growing and developing, he gets angry and resentful and hateful. I tell many of my students sometimes, my female students into my classes at the college, before you get through being educated, many of your husbands are going to leave you, or your family's going to break up. And of course, some of them get angry. What? Who are you to say to what? So and so. But I know the nature of what? Many of the men you deal with. Jealousy. You're hanging out with those college boys. You see, or now you're getting too smart, or now you're trying to move past me. And I've seen women who had to leave college because the husband is giving them such a hard time, or the boyfriend is giving them such a hard time, or he's hanging out in front of the school, or going through all kinds of changes. I've even seen families have their children removed out of the college because this is the first one in college and they are wrestling with this one maybe moving in some kind of way. And so in almost all kinds of blocks are thrown in that way, even if it means keeping up noise or disrupting them in some form or another. Often then they destroy the individual. We love those then who keep us from realizing our self-hatred. You see, one of the reasons why we get so euphoric when we're in love is that by focusing our minds and our energies and our obsession upon another person, by trying to live through another individual, by trying to make that individual our total world, by idealizing that individual and making them some goddess or some god, we think by that it's going to lift us up beyond who we are. It helps us to avoid knowing who and what we are. It keeps us from hating ourselves. through their love, we come to love ourselves. And in that sense, that's why we get stuck on them. We feel that we need them. And when they leave us, we experience what? Depression and suicidal kinds of drives and so forth. Because that self-hatred, which they've made us escape from while they were with us, now comes back to haunt us again, and we get involved. Some people get drunk, and some people actually commit suicide when their lovers leave them, you see, and so forth. So often then, this love, this euphoria that we feel for other individuals is a euphoria based on the fact that they have taken us from truth and taken us from reality and taken us outside of us. That's one reason why we say love is what? Blind. Blinds the individual to reality. So that person you're in love with is not, and who claims to love you back, particularly if that love feeds your self-hatred or helps you to escape your own reality, is not doing you a favor. As a matter of fact, they are part of the problem. That is why often the ones we love are the ones who what? Hurt us and destroy us. In a way, we almost set ourselves up for it when our love is based on unhealthy roots. The consequences of the fear instinct. There's also fear there as well. We often hate the things we fear. The love for our aggressors comes out of fear. What I mean by that, you know, a very peculiar thing happens. You ever ask yourself the question, the Europeans enslaved us, hundreds of thousands of our ancestors died on the ships coming over here. And some of you youngsters and others, when you have a chance to read about how the African was transported over to this country, if it doesn't fill you with hurt and tears, then of course I guess, I don't know, it's hard to describe what you would be. Take time and read this kind of situation where people had to go for weeks at a time with no headroom, with maybe about this much room between them and the floor where they could never stand up, where they laid down on the rough planks and the sea, as it moved the ship, rubbed the very skin and meat off their bones, where they had to lay in their own urination and their own defecation, where they were chained often to people who were dead next door to them and so forth. Look at that kind of thing. You see, many of us can only love our enemies because we haven't read it and we've forgotten. Many of us don't want to read it because it does fill us with anger and hatred and fear and so forth. Many of us avoid Black history because we try to avoid the fear and the anger and the bad feelings it's going to produce in us. But when we avoid it, it also means that we avoid knowing ourselves and who we are as a people. Of course, the slavery is another adventure. Jim Crowism, racial discrimination, all of this. Yet at the end of all of this, why is it that we want to marry these people? Why is it that we want to sleep with them and live with them and roll with them? Why is it we just forget all of the things that they have done to our grandparents and our great-grandparents and the things they're doing to us right now and the things they're going to do to us in the future? You see, why do we do that, you see? Why do we want hair like them? Why do we want noses like them? Why do we want skin color like them? Why do we want to talk like them and walk like them and be like them after they have done all of this kind of stuff to us as a people? Why do we love them more than we love ourselves? Have you ever thought about that kind of issue? And yet this happens all the time. And it is a very standard thing in psychology. We call it love for the aggressor, identity with the aggressor, where one loves the one that persecutes them in an unhealthy sort of way and identifies with the person that persecutes them. This goes on in families. We don't have time to go into the psychological details of this, but this is a part of what Freud talked about when he talked about the Oedipus complex. That his theory is that the boy comes to be like his father because the boy hates his father. And it's a very interesting kind of concept there. He wants to get rid of his father. Then how does he come to be like his father, we say? Because if he comes out and actually tells his father how much he hates him, the father might do what? Destroy him. You see? He's dependent upon his father. He needs his father. And that need and dependency, that fear that his father will hurt him or destroy him, the fact that he feels weak relative to his father, then sets him up to say, I can't express my hatred. I can't express my hostility. And yet this hostility is tearing me apart. This hatred is tearing me apart. How can I get rid of it? And he gets rid of it by saying, then, I'll do what my father says do. I'll be like my father. If I think the way my father thinks, if I behave the way my father behaves, if I look at the world the way my father looks at it, if I have the values that my father has, if I be as much like my father as possible, then I will escape my father's punishment and death. If I can show my father that I love him, that I'm the same as he, then my father will not victimize me. Now, it's a peculiar theory, but it has some interesting aspects about it. To a good extent, the relationship between African peoples and white people is a father-child relationship. We think of ourselves as weak, powerless against the white man. We see him as the source of gifts, the source of blessing. He gives us the jobs, he gives us the protection, he gives us the food, he provides the water, he provides the housing, he provides this, he provides that. You see? And we also think because we're weak, we cannot go directly against him to destroy him, even though he hurts us, even though he degrades us, even though he frustrates us, even though he enslaves us and discriminates against us. We still don't quite get up the drive to say, well, I'm going to destroy this person who degrades me and who is destroying me. Because we feel as if we need him in some kind of way, that we can't live without him. He also tells us that you suffer because you have a different color. You suffer because you have a different kind of shaped nose. You suffer because you have a different hair. You suffer because you come from Africa. You suffer because you don't look like me. And what do we go for then? We say, well, if I want to get out of this suffering, then I should be as much like him as possible. As a matter of fact, if I get so much like him where he can't tell the difference between me and himself, he won't punish me anymore. I will no longer be, what? A victim. So therefore, we are motivated then to come outside of ourselves, to move toward the person that is destroying us and victimizing ourselves, hoping that if we can get them to love us, and if we can show them how much we love them, and if we show them how much alike we can be, we can get them to not see us as colored. You know, look at me, don't look at me as a black person, look at me as a person. You know, to abstract us. In other words, in order for other people to love us, they must not see the blackness of our skins. They must see some kind of invisible abstraction before them. True love is a person who sees you for all of your blackness and your big lips and your big nose, and you kick your hair and still does what? Loves you. If they got to remove your hair and they can't see you standing before them as a black person, they don't love you, ladies and gentlemen. For a person to say, I don't see you as black, how can you not see me as black? I'm standing right in front of you. But this is the kind of thing we want these people to do, to abstract who we are, And therefore, if we become a distraction, that means we leave who we are. We have to come outside of ourselves. That's why we want to be educated with them and educated like them and so forth. We want to not identify in any way with Africa, African people, because to identify with Africa and African people is to suffer. So consequently, we even come to hate ourselves and come to hate our people and come to love the people who destroy us, but it's an unhealthy kind of love. We come to resemble those people. We want to take their values and their orientations toward life. And when they accept us, we escape from our self-hatred. And therefore, we look as if we look for their love to take us outside of ourselves as a people. So consequently, even when we don't love them, when we love even within our own group, we still often look for a kind of love that will take us outside of ourselves, which means then that we become false and unreal and untrue and dishonest and deceptive, unknowing. And how can you develop then a beautiful household and beautiful children and a beautiful community with a love based on this kind of hatred? Too much of the love in this system, not only among black people, but even in this country as a whole, black, white, blue, green, and yellow, is love based on hatred and resentment, on people trying to escape from themselves. It's a love based on fear, you see, fear of rejection. Why do you have that baby? I figured if I didn't have him, he'll leave me. Because the man says, if you don't have it, I'll leave you. The only way I can hold on to him is by having this. What kind of love is that? It's not a productive kind of love, and the problem is, it always what? It almost always fails. It doesn't work out. And you can see hundreds and hundreds of our people, our women and men, trying to hold on to love and hold on to a man and hold on to somebody by having children and families for them, even in marriage. You know, I figured if we have these children, this will bring us together. Big lie. Rarely does having children bring a man and a woman together. You got to be together on your own terms. You cannot put children in that kind of position where they are used to hold you and your man together. That's a misuse of the child. That's then a love that becomes destructive, you see. So it's a love developed out of fear. But people who are fearful love, but they love in a way where they make other people fear them. You see, if they feared, and the greatest thing that an oppressed person fears is really himself and self-knowledge and self-knowing. Because they're afraid when they look at themselves, they're not the big person they think they are. They're not the big hero they think they are. They're not the smart guy they think they are. They're not the cutest guy they think they are. They're not God's gift to women and God's gift to the earth. They have many weaknesses and lacks in their own personality. But they don't want to face that, because if they face that, they figure other people will reject them, will not accept them for who they are. So they project a front upon the world. And they love people who help them support that kind of front. They're running away from anxiety. So their life is built around avoidance. But in order for them to maintain your love, they must make you fear losing their love. So you live in fear of them. Oh, if I don't do this, he'll leave me. If I don't do this, he'll hurt me. And as long as he got you anxious about whether he leave you or whether he's going to reject you or whether he's going to pay you any attention, and you're caught up and build your life around that, it keeps you from seeing who this person really is. It keeps you from seeing his real weaknesses. It keeps you from seeing the emptiness of his life, you see. And therefore, he loves you to the degree that you're blind to who and what he is, and to the degree that you also cannot bring forth and let him see what he is about. And therefore, these fearful people love too, but they love only by injecting fear into the ones they love. They terrorize their wives, they terrorize their children, they terrorize their neighborhoods, and they just terrorize people in general. People have a fear of suffering. A great part of the problems in this world is a fear of suffering. You know, we've grown a generation of people here who feel like there's something constitutionally wrong with suffering, you know? And I guess that may be this movement from the country to the city. You see, if you're born in the country like I, you learn how to suffer and bear it. You know, to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning before sunrise, and whether you feel like it or not, and get out there and do what has to be done, whether you feel like it or not, to solve your problems, to sit down and study, to do your work, whether you like it or not. Your liking it or not has nothing to do with it. But we got a generation here that says, if I don't like it, I have no right to do it. I have a right to be happy all the time. There should not be any suffering in my life at all. That's crazy and it's stupid. And people who try to escape suffering and try to escape pain, because it is through pain and suffering that often you come to know yourself, and you come to grow, and you get strength, and you get character, and you know how to commit yourself to something and do something. But if you get caught up where you're going to escape all kinds of suffering, you're going to lead yourself into destruction, you see. Then you want to stay what? High all the time. You want to stay coked up and doped up and smoked up and liquored up and sexed up and all the other kind of ups, you see. But in the end, it keeps you out of school, it keeps you from learning, it keeps you from growing, it blinds you to yourself, it destroys your family. You got to steal from them, you got to rob somebody, you got to mug somebody, you got to leave your children starving on the floor, you got to leave your wife and the whole bit, because you can't stand what? Suffering. You can't take a little what? Pain. You fear it. You're not a man, you're a child when you fear pain, when you fear suffering, when you fear doing something even though you don't always feel like doing it. That's childish. And yet then many of us, because we have suffered, we figure we have a right now to live happy, you know, forever after. And the only way you can live happy forever after is often by getting into synthetic happinesses, drugs and other kinds of things, and getting away. And if the thing that you fear most is your own self, it means that the only way you're going to get happy is by escaping from yourself, which means you're going to live a totally false life, a disconnected, schizophrenic type of life. So then the ultimate fear then is a fear of self-knowledge. You love someone who helps to maintain your self-unknowing, who keeps you out of yourself. Don't talk about that African stuff. Hey, I would go with that dude, but he's always talking about black people, always talking about Africa. He's into that 1960s stuff. You know, a lot of us like to view people who are dealing with the problems and issues of black people as in the 1960s. I'm talking about now. That wasn't my problem. I wasn't back there then. You have not escaped it, ladies and gentlemen. I don't care how young you are. You can be a babe in arms. The history of your people is with you right at this moment. In fact, that very attitude is the result of the history of your people. When you have it, it means you have been had. You have been suckered.